Thank you so much, Brian. And hello, everybody at the Jam. As you can see, we're going to be talking about building a membership site with 11D. And I have a few assumptions going into this presentation. First, that you have at least beginner familiarity with 11D, that you can write HTML and CSS, that you've worked with non-framework JavaScript, so in other words, vanilla JavaScript. And I just also want to give you a heads up that we'll be moving pretty quickly in this 30 minutes. So definitely check back with the recording later if this is a topic you are interested in. So what do I mean by a membership site? Well, let's scope our project to a few goals and then we'll get going. We want to authenticate users and provide members-only content. We'll also offer partial content previews to unauthenticated users. We'll be building this with 11D, Netlify Edge, and Supabase. And again, no frameworks or bundlers, just vanilla JS, plus a little bit of Dino on the edge. The project requirements for a successful build include 11D v2, the beta that was just released last week, a Netlify account, the Netlify CLI, and a Supabase account, which you'll need because of our user authentication functionality. Now, I do have a lightweight theme prepared. So first, we're going to glance at that theme setup, and then we'll get into building the membership features. All right, so here's our lovely theme, possibly inspired by trends of the day, and a pretty slim 11D build. So just a couple things to point out here. I've customized our input and output directories. So we're going to do all our work inside of the source directory. And then I like to add the layouts as well for just a bit of extra organization. And then also, since we're so tied to Netlify and we're going to be using the CLI, we want to make sure to customize the dev command because we have a little extra processing going on in our start, and we don't want it to make an assumption once it sees that 11D is being used in our project. Otherwise, the build is pretty slim right now. We just have a post directory. That's going to be key later. That's where we're going to have all of our posts for our members only content. And then as you can see, here's kind of the initial look of our site in the browser. I have it flipped to the dark mode for this theme, and then a little preview of what we're working with for a very simple post template. So let's review a couple of the required setup items within Supabase and Netlify. For our Supabase setup, once you get an account, you're going to want to make sure to allow new users sign up. This is actually on by default. The other setting to adjust on this page is to extend the expiry limit to the maximum of 1 week. So in other words, users that log in on our site are going to stay authenticated for up to a week. We also want to go over to the authentication and URL configuration and make sure to change your site URL to your production URL. And a somewhat recently added feature is to add wildcards for both your local host and Netlify deploys. This is important because as we build both locally, deploy to Netlify, whether that's our production or branch deploy, we want our authentication to be able to redirect to the correct environment. Then within project settings for your Supabase, you'll want to get your project URL and the public API key and go over to Netlify. And we're going to create environment variables for the Supabase key, meaning your public key, and the URL. That's all of the setup that we have to do within those two accounts to get started. So let's now look at actually initializing the lowest level of authentication that we can do with Supabase, which is magic link authentication. So back over in our project, I'm going to apply a few updates that we'll walk through. Okay, so you can see that our site has updated a little bit here since I had it running, and we now have a login form. So what's powering that? What's going to happen with that login form? Well, first of all, those environment variables that we just discussed, we need to bring those into our project. And I'm doing that through the idea of 11D's global data. So I have this environment JavaScript, and we're just simply pulling those in and exporting them back out. By the way, these are made available because, again, I'm running the Netlify CLI locally. And because I have those in my Netlify account, that gets pulled in automatically when I do the CLI. I don't have to manage those in both places. Okay, so now that we have the environment variables available, let's take a look at this login form. That's going to be in the includes, my components, and here's that login form. As you can see, the markup's pretty basic. We just have an email input field and then a button to submit. And the key here is, of course, the little bit of scripting that's happening. Now we're keeping things simple. I mentioned we're not using bundlers or anything to manage our JavaScript because we only need a couple functions anyway. And so we're able to get by pulling in the Supabase via CDN. And then we have something that might look a little unfamiliar. So we're taking advantage of Nunjuck's templating to include the script resources. So I have a couple here, the Supabase one and then a login form. Now that Supabase one is actually additional Nunjuck's code. So remember how we just created our environment variables as global data? Well, now we're using Nunjuck's templating to pull those in. And this block ultimately gets rendered as JavaScript code because it's within our script tags. So that's step one, getting essentially our URL and our public key. And then let's take a look at what's actually happening in the login form JavaScript. Okay, so basic submit listener here on the form, which when it happens, we're going to take that submitted value of their email and we're going to send that off to Supabase, which this is the only function that's needed from their API to trigger that magic link authentication. And then we'll give just a little response to the user. So let's demo then what's going to happen after that point. And I'm going to do this part off screen, but you'll see our little feedback message. And then I'll show you what actually happens on our site after that magic link is triggered and somebody has clicked through from the email. Okay, so I've done that, the click through on the email. And what's happened is that Supabase is going to save this local storage token. So normally at this point, for a static site, you would maybe think you need to get a SPA involved, like a Next framework, right? And because you would need more client-side JavaScript to continue managing what happens now that we have an authenticated user. But this is where edge functions are going to come in. So let's review what that means, and then we'll learn how to use them. So our key partner in this is Netlify Edge. And what is Edge? I'm going to give you a really high-level summary, okay? So Edge is low-latency nodes geographically close to the user. This means, practically speaking, that we get faster processing when you're using Edge functions versus serverless. And we can get user-specific data, like their time zone, or pull out cookies. It's essentially middleware to intercept page requests. So this is going to happen. Edge functions are going to happen at the top of the page request before content gets sent down and delivered to the user for the page. So this lets us redirect or modify any requested content for that page. And just a note here that Netlify Edge specifically is going to develop functions using Deno versus Node. So the part that we're interested in doing is authenticating users on the edge. So you can use Edge to authenticate pages and routes and to protect private tokens, again, via our environment variables, and also pass data from the client side via cookies. So that's great, but we're in 11D, and 11D includes a 11D Edge plugin. This lets us access any of the data that we create within an Edge function in our 11D templates via this Edge shortcode. This requires Netlify CLI v10+, again, that 11D v2 beta, and you also opt in from the config file. This is not a separate plugin install. So we will cover what that looks like. But first, let's see how this really comes into practice for the authentication flow of our user coming in and getting authenticated on the site. So you've already done this first couple of steps. Our user can enter their email and trigger login. That's ultimately going to happen either on the home index or an individual post. And then we saw how Supabase auth is going to send that magic link to the user's email. And this is where we're going to change things up just a little bit for our next phase. So we are going to have the user return through their magic link and specifically hit a page we're going to call session. On that session page, Supabase is going to do what we already saw. It's going to save their session data to the local storage, but we're going to add an additional script, session.js, that picks up their session variables and redirects them to the access route. That access route is what's going to finally load our edge function, our login edge function. And this is going to save an access token cookie. Why a cookie? Well, as I mentioned earlier, edge functions can read cookies from page headers. So that's how we're passing client-side data into our edge function. And so we'll be using that to validate their session. And once all that happens, this is all just their initial login process, the user will be redirected to the originating page, so the page they triggered that initial login from. Cool. So let's move on and show the different steps that we're going to incorporate to get that edge authentication. So I'm going to apply a new set of changes here. We didn't really see a change for our login form. It's going to look virtually the same. So there's some behind the scenes changes that happen this time. The first one is that within our login form script, we were just passing email, and that was sufficient for the first phase. But this time, we're adding in this options parameter, and we're going to have that magic link come back, hit that session page we're about to create, and we're also going to save our own query here to know where did the user come from. So that's going to get passed through back to us, ultimately to our edge function. Cool. So what does that session page look like? Well, we want it to be as lightweight as possible. We don't want to load this up into our regular 11D layout because we don't want to load all the theme styles and everything. We want this to be very, very quick. Ideally, the user should be on this page for seconds, if not less than that. So again, we're pulling in the Supabase via API because we need to authenticate the user on this page. We're getting our environment variables, and then we have our new script. So what's happening there? Just in case the user is already coming in authenticated, we'll send them right over to the redirect. Otherwise, here's where we tap into Supabase and specifically the on-auth state function, change function. And once we've detected that they've successfully signed in, then we're going to pull out that redirect query parameter, get their specific session data, and then ship them off to our ultimate edge function. We're capturing a few things along the way. First, that access token, that's going to become the value of that cookie we talked about. And also pretty critically, this expires at variable. So we want to make sure that the cookie has the same expiration date and time as what Supabase has recorded as the valid session for the user. And then that redirects so we can send it back to where they initiated login. Cool. So now it's time to take a peek at the edge functions. So edge functions are going to be outside of our core 11D build. They're a separate thing. And our initial edge function really doesn't care about 11D at all. We're using pretty much purely edge powered capabilities for the first part of the login. And because we're in Dino and because we don't have a connection to our 11D build, we need to separately pull out the environment variables. So we're getting the same ones that we had before, but now we're pulling them out with Dino. And then our all-important function to set our cookie, which we're going to use to both set it and later as an enhancement to unset it when we log out. So here's our actual login function. Let's see what's happening. Because we're in Dino and not Node, we're pulling this functionality out from the CDN, URL based. We're not importing. Supabase does not exist in the package for our project. And then getting those two helpers we just took a glance at. And then finally, we've arrived at the core part of our edge functionality. So when we have an edge function, we get two pieces of two parameters passed in that are important. First is the request. You can see that that's tied to things like the actual URL that is being used for this page, and also the context. And so context is where we'll eventually be able to look in and get out that cookie value. But off of the request, our main thing is to pull out the query parameters we discussed, passing through via the magic link to our session. And now finally they've arrived at the login edge function. And as long as we have a valid access token and that expires at, we're basically just going to go through, do an extra check with Supabase to say, is this still a valid user? You know, maybe that had expired somewhere in between if they didn't get to it right away. And essentially, as long as we don't have any error come up in that process, we're going to set the cookie using that custom function. Here's what it's going to be called, and then setting that expires at date. Finally, after setting the cookie, here's where that redirect comes into play. And the user from their experience is going to have a pretty seamless transition from clicking the link in that email to finally arriving, hopefully, at where they originated login, unless, again, their session has happened to time out. Cool. So that's the major changes in this update. Let's look at the effect of what's going on when we test this out. Once again, I'm going to do this particular step off screen. I'll eventually show you when we get to the next phase here. One moment while I have that link come in. Actually, I will show you this time because I want you to see that the redirect is in fact working. Okay, this is from the first time I triggered it. Here's the second time, the most recent time. I'll click login. And, oh, of course I have an error because this is the live presentation. Let's see. Can't get, oh, we missed a step on our Netlify. Let me do a refresh. That's what I forgot. I forgot to rebuild here. I want to make sure that the CLI is fully aware of the edge function that we passed in. So one moment while we trigger that one more time. Okay, we're getting that built up here. Make sure our site's refreshed. Great. Let's try that one more time. Okay. And I should mention that Supabase does enforce kind of a time limit of you want to wait at least a minute between logins, and so we do handle for that case as well. All right, let's hope this one works this time. There we go. So it passed us all the way through. In this case, we got back to the home because that's the only page with a login so far. So now let's take a look at our application data, check the cookies, and we do have that access token set in here. Great. So that's all well and good. We have our user authenticated. We have our cookies set, so we're able to know whether or not a user is logged in. But now what are we going to do with it? Well, this is where it's time to talk about how to create that members-only content. So again, let's check out what the flow for that is going to look at, and then we'll make those updates. So we want to make sure that authors, whether that's ourselves, whether this is a shared project, maybe even if it's coming out of a CMS, in any case, we're going to have our author determine the gated or members-only content within a premium variable. So after they've set that for a particular post and a user visits that gated post, we're going to have 11D Edge check their auth status with Supabase, and we're going to set a global data variable called isUser. That global data is going to be available within the Edge shortcode. So now we're talking about things specific to 11D Edge. Then if that isUser variable is true, they'll get to see the premium content, and otherwise they'll see partial content and a login form. So let's get to it and set up those steps of our project. All right, so we're going to do this one a little more manually because this is kind of the bread and butter, the newer steps and the things that are more specific to 11D. So our first step here, I'm going to go ahead and shut down our existing build. Our first step is to come into the 11D config, and I mentioned we need to opt into that 11D Edge plugin. It's not a separate install. It's coming from the base 11D install, but we do need to opt in. So we'll import that in and then go ahead and include it with the 11D add plugin functionality. Now at this point, we need to restart our build. 11D is going to recognize that we've now opted in to the Edge plugin, and it's going to create a starter function for us. So we'll let that do its thing. You can see that turn green to tell us that we have some new things in here. And one kind of important step that you'll also find if you visit the docs later about 11D Edge is that we need to ignore this generated directory. This is basically 11D kind of pulling in the things it needs to know about your 11D build to make it available for your Edge function. But we don't really need that to be persisted, so we'll throw that into the git ignore. And again, you'll find those steps on the docs, official docs. Then we are going to go into our Netlify TOML, and just like we added this Edge function path to know that the access route is attached to the login Edge function, we also need to add one for the one we're about to create. And we're going to tie this to specifically that posts directory, because that's where our premium content is going to live. So I'm going to say that anything off the route of posts is going to use the 11D Edge function. Great. So with those setup steps in place, and we kind of learned from last time, I better restart that so that the path works for us. With those steps in place, we can take a look at the 11D Edge function. So this state right now is completely default. This is what happened, as I mentioned, after 11D realized that we're using Edge function. It gives us a few nudges in here with some comments of what you might be able to do. But what we need to do is specifically check if the user is authenticated with Supabase, and then pass down that created is user variable. So in a similar manner as we did for our login function, where we pulled in our utilities, we need to pull in a few of those same ones for the 11D Edge function. So let me get those dropped in. So Supabase and also the environment variables. And then before 11D Edge passes off the data to the template, we're going to insert our logic of checking with Supabase and all those things we talked about. So the first thing we need to do is get that all-important cookie. So here's where we're attaching to the context, and we're going to get that access token and check for that being existing in the user's browser. Then we're going to set up a isUser variable so that we can do pretty similar checks as we did for the login functionality. In fact, if you take a look at this later, you're going to see that, oops, I might have missed a, there we go, just a little out of sorts there. You might see that this is pretty similar to the login one. And similarly, we're checking with Supabase, passing out that access token. And ultimately, as long as we don't have an error, we'll know that we have an authenticated user. Otherwise, of course, it's going to come through as false. So how do we get that information passed down to our 11D template? Well, there's a portion in here where we can attach things to the config. So we have similar methods as you do in your base 11D install. But in this case, we are able to attach global data. Now, normally if we attach global data to our regular config, it's available throughout our templates, it's pulled during static build time, and we can use it wherever. This is unique because it's only going to be available within our Edge shortcode, it's going to be dynamic, and it's going to be isolated to that particular page load that is using the Edge function. So it's going to change per page load, essentially, for any given user session. So now that we have that passed down, let's go over to our example post, and we'll just double check that that's coming through. So we're going to do the very, basic Edge shortcode here. Looks like this normally. We're also letting 11D know that the templating language inside of the shortcode is nunjux. I'm going to save that, and then I'll switch over to our post preview. And good deal. We're working. We've got is user true because we've already initiated through Magic Link, and I did not clear out that existing session. Great. So now that we have that available, we need to move on to the portion of determining which parts of this post is premium content. P.S. Don't be alarmed. What happened there is I saved a post that's now attached to an Edge function, and the hot reload isn't quite working completely smoothly. So if you notice this function, do a regular old browser refresh. You'll probably be back up in business unless there is genuinely an error that needs addressed, which is usually going to pop up in your terminal. Cool. So we talked about using the method of setting a variable to denote which parts of the content is premium content. So I have set this up so my 11D template will accept both Markdown and nunjucks. So we're going to use nunjucks syntax to set our variable, which looks like this. We're going to say set, and then the name of the variable, which in this case is premium. And essentially we're saying anything after the first paragraph is very premium content. We can't have anybody see this lovely cupcake Ipsum if they're not logged in. Cool. So there's our inset on that. And you can see that's disappeared because we haven't told 11D what to do with that content. So at this point, it's time to bring in the logic of checking with our Edge function, seeing if we have a user, and either showing the premium content or showing a login form. So how we're going to handle that is we're going to create one more component, and we're going to call it a gate. So let's get that created. And I'm just going to populate this in and kind of walk through it. So again, we're going to this time process both nunjucks and Markdown because we want to process that Markdown coming through via the premium variable. Now, Edge is not familiar or aware of any data outside of itself. So if it's not passed in through the Edge function, then even though this is 11D Edge, it's not going to be aware of any other data in your 11D build. So we have to explicitly pass this in, and due to some syntax reasons, if we want it to be a named variable, we have to use this object syntax pattern. Okay, so essentially our logic is saying as long as we have premium content, also check if there's a user, and if both those conditions are true, we're going to output that premium content. Now, because we need this to be registered kind of per page or per post, and because that premium variable is not set in our front matter, we do need to, unfortunately, include that gate at the end of each post that this is relevant towards. Let me do a little refresh here. Okay, so since I'm logged in, essentially it's worked, right? We're showing this. But let's do just kind of hack around our way to log me out since we don't have the logout function. I cleared that cookie and the local storage as well. Do a little refresh, and we see the opposite logic working. But we mentioned that ideally, instead of just nothing, we want to show a login form here. It's going to be the same shared component as we used on the home page. So over in our gate component, we are going to bring that in. Now, again, it's not aware of our includes or any data, so we have to set this up in a similar manner as that premium variable, where we're actually tossing the markdown of the login form into a variable, and then we'll tag that on to our Edge function and add the else condition. So if it's user, they get premium. Else, we want to show the login form. It is able to use the filter of safe. Some of these are available for Edge. So that just means instead of encoding the HTML output to actually render it, and there we go. Now, one little kind of enhancement we can do really quick is at this point in this context, joiner login isn't completely the right message that we would like to use here. So we'll make one more little tweak to be able to customize the headline for this context. The first step is to go into login form up to the hard-coded headline here. And we're going to swap it out so that it'll accept the login headline variable or fall back on joiner login. And then within our gate, we can customize what that's going to be. Cool. So there's our customized one. So we've got one last test run through to see, make sure this whole flow works. So if it works for us, what's going to happen is I'm going to get that magic link, get logged in, and ultimately come back to this post. And I will show you that flow as well as soon as that new magic link comes in. All right, so I'm going to log in. We'll come back to the post. And there we go, success. We not only got redirected, but we, of course, see that premium content. And we're good to go. That is kind of the very essential starter baseline functionality for getting gated premium content in 11D. So what's next, right? There's a few things we didn't quite have time to do in this initial starting point. So ideally, we would change the homepage state for authenticated users. Right now, we're still going to have the login form appear on the homepage because we haven't actually included that in our Edge routing. Ideally, we'd enable a sign out button. And then some things you might choose to do are have some sort of user dashboard. And you can persist even more user profile data back to Supabase. So we're only using the authentication, but you can expand that to more functionality. You might add in payment processing. Right now, it's just, all going to be free content just behind a login. And I also encourage you to look into another new 11D feature, WebC, to maybe save content bookmarks or perform other client-side interactions. Again, so you can kind of use the progressively enhanced methods without having to load an additional JavaScript framework. Shortly, I'm going to be releasing what I just showed you as a little theme. And so these first two steps have been completed in that theme. Thank you so much. I know that was really fast and furious. So again, check out 11d.rocks. In a few minutes, I'll post in chat when it's available to get the theme and dive into that a little deeper.
That was fantastic. I've dealt with this problem before. Pre-Edge functions and did everything client side, and it was never ideal. And for a while, like CFE, you had to log in to be able to get access to like meetups and the archives and stuff like that. And all of it was client side because it is a Hugo site. So like all the JavaScript was client side. But the experience was never ideal because you do get that flash, where I assumed you weren't logged in, and then if you were, I'd show you the stuff, right? And it's just, it didn't look right. Yeah.
Well, and it's also tucked behind. The other part that bothered me, you just made me remember, is, in that scenario, it's technically just tucked behind. You could hack your way into seeing that content, but with Edge, it's not there. It's not going to show up in the source.
Yeah, for sure. So if anybody has any questions, we got a little less than 10 minutes with Stephanie here. Just please go ahead and put your questions in the Ask a Question module. I think, if you all were like me, you were like paying close attention because you did cover a lot of ground. So I think your question probably just coming to your head right now. But one of the things there's a couple of things I want to touch on because you talked a lot about Edge. And I did want to note, you mentioned WebC, and Ray's going to be talking about that at the end of the day, 11 and WebC. So if you're interested in that, just stick around. So one of the things I want to talk about, because I think people don't realize, when you talk about Edge, it depends on which provider you're talking about, what the runtime is. For you're using Netlify, so Netlify is Dino, and then there are considerations you have to deal with the different runtimes. I mean, is there anything in particular you think people should know when they're dealing with that? Did you run into any trouble having to integrate, switching from a node environment in 11e to Dino for the Edge, or was it all seamless for you?
For this particular flow that we explored, it worked out. I have a project where the reason I learned about, figured out this flow in the first place was I'm using, a few more functionalities and adding in the payment processing. And so what I did learn from that, because I hadn't had a reason to get into Dino or learn the difference before all that, um, was that, and I'm not going to remember the name of it now, but there is something that you can use where some node packages are able to be transformed or whatever needs to happen to work in Dino land. But I would recommend that you make sure whatever you're interested in using is going to be compatible in that environment. So that's where the Netlify CLI is nice. Or I'm not familiar with other providers, to know what capabilities anybody else provides, but checking into that ahead of time, making sure it runs locally, but also making sure it runs on a branch deploy. I hit that with my other project where I thought it was fine and dandy, pushed it up, and it didn't work all the way end to end as I expected. So yeah, it can run into caveats, but overall, the intention of Edge is not to do too much, right? It's to do one kind of isolated function at a time. Ideally, there's obviously reasons to be more complex, and my other project does have more complexities, but it's a different way of thinking for sure as well, to know when's the right time to bring it in for your project.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things, which, I think if you're doing what you said, which is mostly like throwing small things at the edge that people aren't ever going to realize it, but like there's strict limits on how long it can run, how much memory it can use, that are much, much stricter than your typical serverless function that could run. Like, I mean, I think even Netlify now has the long running like background functions kind of, so, whereas like edge functions have very strict, very tight limits on how long you can run and how much memory you can use for that. So most things I think is going to be fine, but like, yeah, good to be aware of. The other thing I think I want to clarify for folks, and I want to get you to kind of discuss in maybe more depth, is the difference between, you start off in one was a regular Netlify function that you threw in the edge functions, like in Netlify edge function, you threw in the edge functions folder, and then the other was the 11 edge, which then was in a different place. And I guess the key difference for folks is like the regular edge function isn't dealing in the rendering, whereas the I'm assuming the 11 edge now has rendering aspects to it. Am I understanding that correctly?
The way we were using it, yes, more or less. So the 11 edge is going to specifically be your way, if you're using 11 to pass data. That's where we had that global data addition. Whereas our login function that was separate was just sort of using the general processing availability of Edge to make that login a little faster, and to set our cookie was the other functionality we had there. So we didn't need to do any rendering. It was really just a pass through. It was in taking that information, setting the cookie, and then immediately redirecting away. So yeah, that's right. I think a strength as well of using Edge.
Right. So like that function, like you were able to set the cookie. And I guess in theory you could modify the response HTML, but like it doesn't pass anything back to your templates, and you can't use your. Right. You'd have to like manually like go through and use a library to kind of modify the HTML directly, right? As opposed to the 11 edge now lets you pull that data in and use your templating language and do everything the 11 way, as opposed to like, throwing it in some other kind of function, right?
Yeah. So if you take a peek at the 11 edge, or excuse me, a template where you intend to also render from Edge, if you look at your public folder, because that happens later, right, on page request, what's happening behind the scenes is you won't see anything in the DOM, the natural static DOM of that template. You will see a comment that's essentially a placeholder. So when edge runs on that particular page, that comment gets swapped out is what's actually happening.
Hmm.
So yeah, again, like I mentioned earlier, you're not going to see anything there if there's nothing to show for the edge function. Like if you're not actually running that page, um, making it an edge powered route, if you will.
Right. And so the edge stuff that you showed, this is exclusively the 2.0 beta that came out like a few days ago, or
Yeah, it
was it
came
available
around.
on the?
Yeah, it started. The very, very first version was Canary v7. So there was, I think, ended up with 30 canaries before the beta release last week. So install with the beta is probably your best option, regardless, especially if you're starting fresh or looking to upgrade. And by the way, there's a post on 11D Rocks on upgrading if you need help with that.
Yes, right. I did share that one recently. Yeah, so it was a good post. And what, speaking of that, like I know we were just specifically talking about the edge stuff, but my last thing, like what other, like, given that the 2.0 beta just came out, like, I mean, are there other features you're really excited about that are in 2.0?
Yeah, so Edge was one of two big features. The other was WebC that we've hinted at. So yeah, definitely stick around for a Raven talk later. But also there's some general improvements kind of periodically. So I've definitely been one where I've, been kind of keeping up with it along the way as I've been continually, building various things along the way. So I'm trying to remember what else would be really stand out. The good news is there's not really a lot of breaking changes. There's really minor stuff if anyone is concerned about that. And there's also an upgrade helper plugin. So it'll help you identify if you do have anything that, is going to be problematic. But I think my understanding is, most folks aren't going to encounter anything too breaking. There's some just kind of quality of life improvements depending on how you like to run your setup, like allowing a little different name for the config. And there are some changes to be aware of related to the data cascade. So look into that if you're doing anything custom. There's also an update that kind of slipped in V1 kind of late that I'm not sure folks were aware of that got enhanced to be able to accept custom template formats. So for example, making CSS or Sass a first class templating language for your build. So if you completely missed all of that, that would be a pretty standout feature that I still have to dive in a little bit more myself and update some of my starters to use. So check
Right.
that kind of thing out.
And I know Lene talked yesterday about the internationalization stuff, which I guess is new too. So
yeah, yep.
Yeah. So last quick, we're almost out of time. Last quick question, completely unrelated, but both of us behind the scenes were like Potter, who was running the show, and like we're wondering how the heck did you blur out certain sections of your screen when you brought stuff over and not others? Like we're like, oh, I've never done that before. How do you do that?
I am in a Chromium-based browser, and I just quickly found a plugin ended up being called Zero Blur. So I was able to either do all inputs or select which things to blur out, like the email inbox sidebar.
Nice. Okay. For those of us who like to present, that's super, super useful.